what I'm going to do is give some context behind it, why we did the surveys, go through the surveys and findings, and then finish off with what we're going to do with the results that we found. So just put it in context, really I suppose SuDS have been around, sustainable drainage systems have been around for a long time, 30, 40 years in terms of concept, but in the UK it was really the floods of 2007 which kicked off a lot of interest. The top picture is Tewkesbury Abbey. As you can see, it forms an island in the floods of 2007. And the bottom one is Evesham, but there were equally floods in Yorkshire and Humberside. So to put a bit of a timeline from the floods, what happened was that the government put forward a pit review, which published its report in 2008. And then in 2010, the Floods and Water Management Act was passed. And in that was a Schedule 3, which was about putting sustainable drainage systems as part of the planning process and making them mandatory on all new developments. The Water Act, which followed the Floods and Water Management Act, didn't come about until 2014. In that, of interest to highways was that there was an attempt to make highways authorities responsible for putting sustainable drainage on all highways, etc. But that amendment was actually taken out in the final reading. Moving forward, 2015, the long-awaited technical standards for SuDS were published, but they were non-statutory, so they have no real teeth to them. And that was followed by, there we go, in April 2015, changes to the National Planning Policy Framework. In essence, DCLG pulled the concept of using SABs, Sustainable Bodies, and replaced it by saying SuDS will be part of the planning system. DEFRA in 2016 talked about resilience in the water sector, which included drainage and so on. And in November 2016, DCLG announced that they were planning a review on planning and how SuDS in particular were being incorporated. In 2017, SIWEM published the results from the survey that they did. It was called A Place for SuDS. And the Committee for Climate Change did a report to government in 2017, Progress in Preparing for Climate Change, which included some recommendations to try and improve the uptake of sustainable drainage systems. It's probably true to say that the government's response to that was a bit lacklustre and almost saying, no, the status quo is fine. But more recently, in October, the EFRA committee sent a letter to Michael Gove, who's the Environment Minister, and in essence saying the committee's disappointed. Now that's political speak for why hasn't this happened, you need to make it happen, and also using the phrase wish to see demonstrable progress on the installation of high quality SuDS, or it may wish to consider calling for commencement of Schedule 3 of the Floods and Water Management Act. So it just feels like we're going Groundhog Day, it's all coming back round again. Whether Schedule 3 will be implemented or not, I personally have my doubts. I think it will be a bit of a way forward in terms of the DCLG strengthening the planning system. So in all that, there's very little to do with highways apart from the water bill and an attempt to get highways put into that. So why are we interested in SuDS and highways? Well, okay, this is 2012. The picture on the left is the M5 in Somerset. The picture on the right is Central Motorway in Newcastle. So you can see that, you know, surface water, rainwater in the wrong place on highways is a problem. But anyone who's aquaplaned on the M1 on a rainy night knows that it's not just an inconvenience when you get it wrong, it's actually a safety issue. So the consideration from the highways both Highways England and also the Highways Authority, has primarily been safety. And so drainage has been the key. Get the water off the carriageway as quickly as possible. Now, traditionally, particularly on motorways, it's been done with gullies and point drainage. Of course, that's an issue going forward, because if you're using smart motorways, you have a running lane effectively where you had a hard shoulder where you could do the drainage before. So even with traditional drainage, what do you do with the water you've collected? Well, that's where sustainable drainage systems come in. And I think it's fair to say that Scotland is very well advanced on SuDS in highways. You can see the document there, which was a combination of Highway Scotland, SEPA, Scottish Water, actually put together recommendations for how you handle SuDS in roads. And even in the good old DMRB, Design Manual for Roads and Bridges, there is Volume 4, Section 2, which that advice note talks about vegetated drainage systems for highway runoff. And I know that the DMRB is being rewritten at the moment, and some of it is going to incorporate other SuDS elements which are acceptable to Highways England. So going forward, we can see that it's going to become more and more important. But some local councils are already adopting the highways authorities. This is an example from Islington, and you can see there it talks about SuDS within highways would be adopted by Islington Council and maintained as part of the wider highways maintenance programme, and it goes on to talk about other local authorities. But again, I think it's fair to say that it can be a bit patchy in terms of which local councils are adopting and which aren't. So, SuDS surveys, always good to have a survey. Why do we need more surveys? I already said there was the SIWEM survey, there have been other ones in terms of drainage and SuDS and so on. Well, with all the policy, guidance, everything that's been going on, we're still finding that SuDS are not being implemented. In fact, the Committee for Climate Change said that just 15% of planning applications contain the word sustainable drainage. So, whereas previous reports, surveys have called for stronger policy, in other words, a top-down approach to SuDS implementation, what we're finding is that at the sharp end, that they're not being implemented. So why is that? Can we actually find out what stops them being implemented, and what are the barriers? Identify the barriers, and then what are the enablers for practitioners? ACO sponsor the Institute of Civil Engineers SuDS Task Group, which I happen to be chair of. And we put out a survey in January 2017, which was very well responded to. You can see over 400 respondents coming from various sister organisations. It went out to quite a broad range of organisations, and the analysis is quite interesting. So, what were the role of respondents? And you can see here, by far the biggest were lead local flood authorities and consulting engineers. But there were highways authorities, 5% of the respondents were highways authorities. So it was a fairly broad view. It wasn't focused specifically on highways, and to be honest, it mainly came back, it was non-highway stuff, but we'll come on to the highway survey in a minute. So what were the findings? Well, first of all, whether they were expert or non-expert, the SuDS manual, SIRIUS C753, was by far the most used resource. And then local authority SuDS guidance and so on and so forth. So you can see there's quite a broad range of information there that people can use as resources. So what were the issues? Well, in terms of finding information, the highest one was not enough examples of good practice. And just keep that one in mind for later on when we talk about the highways survey. And then no clear route map. I think probably one of the things which came out from the answers to the survey was that people felt confused as to what they should be doing when, etc., because there were lots of bits all over the place. So could there be a route map to actually help them through the process and know where to go? One of the questions was, what are the barriers to SuDS? You can see, not unexpected, the top ones were ownership, adoption, okay, lack of understanding, but then maintenance costs and difficulties. So adoption and maintenance are by far the biggest barrier to SuDS implementation. So follow-up question is, if these are the barriers, what would help? Well, case studies are good practice, came out top, route map, as I already mentioned, and then cost-benefit tools and so on. So case studies and route maps by far the most valuable enablers in terms of implementation of SuDS. As a follow-up to the ACO ICE SuDS survey, we carried out a SuDS in highways survey. Some of the questions were very similar, but obviously what we wanted to do was see whether the response from highways-focused practitioners was different to the general feeling. It went out in October through Highways magazine. Much smaller response, but that was to be expected because we had a very short window as well. And you can see that the majority of respondents came from local authorities and consultants. So these, if you remember the ICE survey, it was lead local flood authorities, local authorities and consultants. So it's a similar sort of feel to the respondents, but obviously these are more focused on highways rather than the general development. So what do we find? Most common problems, looking for information, not enough UK examples of good practice, information not specific for individual projects. Now what I've done on this slide is actually the red one, the red bars are the highways response and the blue one are the ICE response, so you can compare where the differences are. And you can see that it was common, not enough information, not the right information, but then highways respondents were a bit more relaxed about the information provided and whether it's in different places and so on, which probably gels with our understanding that, you know, highways being very specific, there is guidance, there is policy, etc., which actually is consistent and it's well known when it's updated, whereas in the general SuDS field it's a bit all over the place and people have trouble understanding where to go and when it's being updated. Barriers, well, okay, there was 22 opportunities. If I actually, what we've done there is that the one on the left is a weighted average. So in other words, what you're looking at is all the things that people responded to as a barrier. It doesn't look, it basically looks like everything's a barrier if you look at that one. So what we then did was say, which are the major barriers? Which ones are people recording as a 4 or a 5 in terms of being a barrier rather than the 1s and 2s? And what you can see there is that adoption comes out as the major barrier, ownership of land, ownership of SuDS, and then selection of appropriate SuDS components being a major barrier. And comparing that, and just taking, for example, the top 10, comparing the highways ranking with the ICE ranking, you can see that they're virtually identical in the top 10 of barriers, all apart from one, which is the selection of appropriate SuDS components, which was number 4 for the highways survey, but which was very low on the ICE survey. So for highways, selection of appropriate SuDS is an issue, which isn't so much the case in other SuDS schemes. But looking at the bottom 10, in other words, the ones which are of least barrier to the highways, you can see some quite big differences. And one big difference is down at the bottom end in terms of incorporating multi-benefit systems in SuDS. So things like water quality, amenity, and then biodiversity above that, which don't seem to be a problem for highways, but are more of a problem for general developments. Interestingly, national planning policy was a major barrier for general use, whereas it wasn't so much of one problem for highways, probably as you'd expect. Non-highways were actually more concerned with cost as well, both capital cost and whole life cost, than highway SuDS practitioners were. Again, we could go into all sorts of trying to understand what the reasons for that are, but I think some of them are fairly self-evident. And the one which was interesting from my point of view was the designing for climate change, which non-highway applications seem to be quite comfortable with, because there's a lot of guidance out there in terms of climate change allowances, but it wasn't so much of a problem, so it was seen as more of a barrier for highways. So what do we pull from that? Well, in both cases, both surveys showed that adoption and maintenance were the biggest issues, and I think that comes clearly as a message from the industry in terms of who adopts it, who maintains it, and so on. It's not clear at the moment, particularly on non-highway applications, even on highways, whether it's adoptable by the highway authority or not. So again, that's one of the issues which I'll leave hanging out there, because I don't think there is an immediate answer to it. There's all sorts of various views as to what it should be, but we just have to watch the space. Where we can do something is in terms of the non-highway side. We're really looking for route maps to point them to information, and the most up-to-date information. So what the ICE task group, SuDS task group, is doing is actually putting together route maps. This one, we basically split it down into different sections, so starting with the concept and strategy, right the way through to maintenance, and even including retrofit. And what the route maps will look like is something like that. So at the top, you've got the phase, or what you're going through. The next level down is the activity, and then the resource, and those will actually be, the ones down at the bottom will actually be hyperlinked to websites and other resources, so most up-to-date information available. That's a graphical example. It's not actually complete yet, it's still in development, so it will change slightly, the content will change, etc. But for highways, the takeout that we got was really the things that we could help with, assist with, are helping with applicable case studies. That's the thing that was coming out quite strongly from there, and also in terms of assisting in selecting SuDS components. So we've been with CIHT, we've been running a series of SuDS CPDs, which is to help interested professionals become much more aware of the possibilities and the things that you can do in terms of sustainable drainage. And we will continue that focus on supporting the highway sector in 2018. And one of the things that we do is we produce case studies, and the picture there, for example, is the A12 Norfolk project, which included a number of sustainable drainage features, and the one shown there is a swale with a swale inlet, for example, and that's probably fed by a combined curb drainage.